So let's move to social studies. Item number 9 is the Social Studies Standards Interagency Agreement, IAA. And I know Vice Chair Earl is involved in Deputy.
I'm sorry, Chair, may I interrupt very quickly?
Sure.
My civic clerk is not working. Is it just me or is it everybody?
Let's see. Anybody else? We're having a glitch. Let's take a second and all right, let's give this a shot. We are going to move to item number 9. Action item 9.1 is the interagency agreement scope of work on social studies standards. And I think Vice Chair Earl and Deputy Superintendent Norman have the wheel on this one.
I'll make a motion.
Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman, we were going to start by talking to the need and why there's been a change between the interagency agreement and now we're going back to an RFP. And Chair, may I call Adam Hurd up to the...
Please.
Okay. And Adam can come up as well to be able to speak to the difference between what we found out between our last meeting and this meeting that prompted us to move in this direction. So Adam?
Yeah, Adam Hurd, Director of Purchasing and Contracts. So, yeah, since last board meeting with our last discussion regarding the interagency agreement route, it was discovered that we don't actually, the USBE does not do interagency agreements with LEAs any longer. We had in the past, but there was a recent policy change. Our participant support cost policy was implemented, and we decided to use that process when we're contracting with educators to provide services on behalf of the agency, and in doing so decided that we would no longer be engaging in interagency agreements with the LEAs. So with that in mind, we had to reconsider the process that we were going to use moving forward, and we're looking at, I think, either a competitive grant process or going back to the request for proposals.
Okay, and I would talk with a number of staff members and just would like to put this motion forward. That the board approves, all right, let me do it. I don't know which direction. That the board approves the 2023 Social Studies RFP process as presented. USBE impanels an RFP Social Studies Committee to oversee the RFP process for the Social Studies Standards K through 6. The committee consists of 3 board members and appropriate staff. Board members may submit social studies RFP recommendations to the committee to elementary social studies specialist for consideration by February 16th at 5 o'clock. The committee reviews recommendations and other related materials and publishes an RFP. The committee reviews the RFP vendor proposals and selects a vendor. The committee prepares a contract between USB and the vendor and places it on the USB consent calendar for approval in a regular USB board meeting. And after the contract is approved and signed, the committee convenes to review the vendor's deliverables at key checkpoints as outlined in the RFP and contract. And I would like to add one.
Second. Is that part of the motion?
I want to add one more
Okay.
item to it, and that's using $500,000 from our discretionary fund, our discretionary state discretionary funds, and $500,000 from our mineral lease funds. That's my motion.
Is there a second?
Yes, it would be $500,000 from our mineral lease and from the state, from our discretionary funds. So it would give it. Yes, and I can speak to that in a minute.
Is there a second to that motion?
Did I say 5 or 4? Well,
You said 5.
I meant 4 of each of those. My apologies.
All right. Motion's been seconded.
And I just want to speak to that. I just think creating a simplified process for an RFP, if we put a committee together with 3 board members that can oversee this process and then bring it before us instead of trying to move all that here, and also that committee would make decisions on any recommendations that came forward from board members themselves. and I'll speak to the two pots of money. When we went out for, districts were asking for resources in providing this. We did an RFI. The monies that came back, the low was around $1 million, and then the high was multi-million. That's why we're looking at other avenues. I think we've got monies available in these different areas that can be used for this. I checked with Scott Jones if it can be used in this capacity. It would bring that total up to about $1.3 million in order for this RFP process to take place. And so, I don't know. Anyways, that's my motion.
All right, discussion of the motion. Member Klein, Member Davis, and Member Lear.
Okay, just a clarifying question. It says K6 on that, but then there's a supporting document uploaded to Civic Clerk that's entitled Pre-K6 Social Studies Curriculum Scope of Work that they're supposed to use. Is it pre-K or is it K6? Pre-K through 6 or K6?
I was using the social studies standards we just approved, but I think it would be accurate that it would probably include the pre-K. So I would probably need to make a change to that.
Well, I wouldn't vote for it if it says pre-K, just saying.
Okay.
Okay, Member Davis.
Can someone remind me is this required in code that we do this kind of combined curriculum to have a choice for LEAs? It's not a mandated thing, but it's a choice. And if it's required in code, why aren't we seeking a fiscal note? Why are we using $1 million of our discretionary money or even $800,000?
Is that a question for Vice Chair Earl or for staff?
Ask it one more, I'm sorry, one more time? Oh,
Why are we doing it? Why are we doing it?
Chair, if I may.
Please.
Yeah, the original intent was to be able to use $500,000 of carry forward money from the teaching and learning. It was a request that came to us from the superintendents as they looked at the standards that were being reviewed and created. We're recognizing the fact that every single word mattered in the standards. And in looking at the standards, because there was so much time spent on them, they realized there's not going to be any off-the-shelf product. So they asked for us to be able to collectively create some sort of a resource for them to be able to either, kickstart or provide for them, or each one of them would end up having to create them on their own. If you look at the standards that were created, for example, in, let's say our, Utah history or fifth grade or whatnot, they are very specific to the state of Utah. So it was just a collective thing. There was a survey that was sent out. I think that's in your backup as well, that has the responses from the LEAs about what it is that they would like, who would use it, what that looks like. And so the original intent was for the $500,000 to be able to, group some teachers together, an LEA or a consortium of LEAs, to be able to deliver this content in a way that we've done before in the prior IAA method, which is no longer a possibility. So there could be the grant way, there could be the RFP way. Either way, the board will need to decide what are the deliverables, the outcome of what it is that they want in their final product.
Does that answer the question, Member Davis? I think next up was, or if it did, next up was Member Lear.
And I had a clarifying question about your motion. The committee can say, okay, the board members shall submit social studies RFP recommendations. So what do you mean by that? What would what would board members, and I'm assuming that's all board members, not just that committee?
Yes, that would be. And it would be, so in doing curriculum, often there's guiding principles associated with it. Or if they have a recommendation for specific focus in curriculum areas. So they would bring recommendations if they chose to, and then those could be considered by the committee that's put together.
So the committee's not bound by those?
No, it would be recommendations,
Just
so
here's
yes.
some ideas about what I'd like to see in the
Yes.
curriculum.
Yes.
Thanks.
Member Wood.
Just a quick question. So in the initial RFI, it was between 1 million and 33 million. What, if you're saying, oh, well, we have 1.3 million, why not go with why go through this process on the side if we've already done an RFI?
We did RFI, but that was just for information. An
Okay.
RFP would be the actual contract. So even if we previously said we think we want to go this direction, we would still have to
to
do
go
an
through this
RFP. So
process.
this is just putting those pieces in place.
Okay, so you think that with this RFP potentially this company that said they could do it for.
Well,
1
I don't
million
know
could
which
come back.
company. We'd put it out for anybody. It wouldn't be,
Right.
right?
But
And then
it-
people would submit their bids.
But knowing that the bids were so high to begin with.
And keep in mind, I think when we put the original bid out for RFI, it was sky's the limit. Does that make sense? So there would probably need to be, these are the items we're interested in. Can you do it for this amount? That kind of a thing. Does that clarify? Okay.
Chair?
Member Klein? Oh, I'm sorry, Deputy Norman? Member Klein?
Okay, a couple questions. So the bids that went out, or the RFPs that we received before, are those, they're not on the table right now? None of those, and they're going to, but they could resubmit. Is that correct?
An RFI, unless you can correct me if I'm wrong, is just to get information. So you put, it's getting information from companies to know what is available or what could be pursued. And now the RFP, you would put that out, and then they would,
Yes.
whoever chose to. It might not be any of these companies.
So it's just starting the process over as far as gathering who wants to make a bid?
Yes.
Okay, so the other question has to do with my first one that I did earlier on this supporting document that says pre-K 6 social studies curriculum scope of work. At the bottom, it says that this draft is for consideration during the February 2nd board meeting. Are we voting on this as well?
No.
That's not the one.
Go ahead, Vice
It's
Chair.
just a Word doc, no charts on it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's just backup information.
It says draft on it, and it says would, to be considered in the February 2nd meeting.
And I,
It's,
Do we know?
I think it's just
Deputy
backup
Norman?
information, but
Is that the question, or? Let's see.
I think it was to give information as to what the direction was originally, if that makes sense.
So I
because-
guess to clarify, that's not part of the present motion?
it looks like
Or-
what it's the scope of work that they will be bidding on. Or what they will be basing their proposal on, the way it's written. Is that correct? Patty?
Yes, Chair.
Deputy Norman,
Yeah.
yes, please.
So the IAA that was in backup is something that is no longer being done. So that whole process is moot at this point. And so they would be moving to this process, according to Vice Chair Earl's motion, it'd be moving to this process in its place.
So this document that's on the screen was specific to the IAA? Is that what you're saying? And it won't be put out with the RFP?
Correct. And let's go ahead and if Joanna or Jennifer, if you want to come in, and maybe we can have Adam speak to that as well, the differences of what would be put out for the IAA or the RFP.
Yeah, thank you. Joanna Sorensen, is that something you can field? Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you ask that one more time? I heard my name and.
Yeah.
Are you
want
asking
me
about
to
the
ask?
IAA?
Question,
Okay.
yeah,
I'm sorry, Board
question
Member
for
So
Klein,
Member
there's
Klein.
a
document.
supporting document
Yes.
in there that lists out all the things that they want incorporated into the curriculum that is created.
Yes.
Right? Is this still on the table? Is this what, will this go
No,
out with the RFP?
No, I don't think so. I think what would go out is what Board Member Earl is proposing. This was what I was directed to do in the last board meeting as
Okay.
the scope of work for the IAA to bring back to the board, but then that got scrapped.
Okay, so we're not
So-
giving, so
but-
we're
but-
not giving the vendors any specifics like this to just the standards?
It would be what, if this passes, it would be what that committee that Board Member Earl is proposing puts together. So
Okay.
this is the scope of work that we as staff had designed for the IAA to bring back to the board today
Okay.
for consideration, but now the IAA is not happening. So that's moot unless this committee decided to take a look at our suggestions.
Okay, well, can I make a comment based on something for that committee to consider? If they're going to look at this,
Member Klein, is this
Yeah.
a comment for the committee? So if the motion passes, there will be committee which will invite input from all board members. Is this speaking to the
Okay.
motion or speaking towards the potential
well,
input?
it's just
if it passes?
information for the committee for when, if this passes. This document that was currently put out
So
for
let's
the
speak to the
IAA.
motion if you could, but go ahead. I just want to make sure we're speaking to the motion, and then if a process is established, then we'll all have that input.
fine.
Go ahead, Member Klein. I want to make sure you're heard. I want to make sure we distinguish between voting on the process and then participating in the process if it.
Yeah, I just have
happens.
concerns that I want
Go ahead.
addressed by the committee.
Yeah, go ahead.
that, it's a recommendation. So this original document requires that the standard, the curriculum uses the high-quality instructional framework or cycle to be, that it be taught through that lens and also through Utah MTSS, the multi-tiered systems of support. And I have issues with both of those documents because it completely changes how the curriculum is going to be created, what it's framed around, or the lens through which it's created, and which this HQI cycle, the high-quality instructional cycle, is iterative. It has 6 cycles. In each cycle, there's 6 areas, and those 6 areas all
Okay.
include equity and social emotional learning, which changes the whole lens through which this will be created. And so I want to make sure that, and the MTSS is the incorporating the behavioral modification interventions with the curriculum, which is highly problematic. And I want to make sure that those are not included in the creation of this curriculum.
All right, thank you, Member Klein. And my understanding is if the motion passes, that such input will be an opportunity for any committee, any board member to weigh in. Any further discussion to the motion?
I
Member
did have another question,
Lear.
so I forgot. Can somebody explain to me, and Patty might be the best, or Mr. Hurd?
It says
Oh,
it's on.
sorry, it says it's on. I'm not speaking into
Oh,
it.
sorry.
I have a question about the process. It seems unusual to me, but I'm not sure, that the board members are creating the RFP. Is that typically a staff process? Could you explain to me, Patty or Mr. Hurd, how, or whoever would be otherwise in charge of this if the board members were not? What this would look
Is that
like?
for Deputy Norman?
Yeah, I can start, and we'll have Adam as well, so thank you. It is not a part of a traditional process, but it has been done before. We can think of 2 different instances, one with the assessment. We had board members on the committee, and then I cannot remember the other one, but it has been done before where board members are on the committee for an RFP.
And just to follow up to that, so the staff people would definitely be participating with us and, or whoever the committee is, and guiding us, because I'm an attorney. I've read lots of RFPs. I've written RFPs, and I'm not specialized enough to write a good RFP. So I want to make sure that this is not a board member only, or even a board member driven, more a board member participation in. Is that the way?
Is that a
So-
question for,
Is that the
Director
way you're
Norman?
viewing it?
And
Oh.
Chair,
All right,
if I may,
yeah, Deputy Norman.
if I may, there might be, so thank you for that question. There might be clarification that is needed. I think as written, so this would be a good clarifying question. As written, it says the board members and appropriate staff. So in my mind, if I were to be implementing this and moving this forward, I would think that it was the board members that were making the decisions, and staff would be making sure the process would be followed. So if it is the board members and staff making this decision, I think that needs to be clarified. So my understanding of this is the 3 board members are working through this and looking through this. The staff is there to aid that decision-making, to be able to say, here's what's in, what the code says, here's what the standards say, here's what the process is. So I just want to make sure, for clarity there, what the role of staff would be.
Vice Chair Earl, you
Well,
want to address that?
I guess what I envisioned in this motion is that they would be working together because they've got, as said here, they have the expertise in a variety of areas, including the writing of contracts and putting those out. So I can't see that being a secondary role, but it would be a combined role.
And then, Chair, there was one more question, with Board Member Wood, and it was asking about the $1 million. And so I didn't know if this was a part of that question. That original $1 million that was sent in was only for 3 grades instead, is that correct? 3 grades. And then of those 3 grades, it was just to create the curriculum, and then we would have to license it from them every year. So then there would be an additional cost every year after that. I just wanted to make that clarification of what $1 million would buy.
Thank you. Member Straight.
Yes, I think it's important to remember why we're in this space right now. And that is because we developed the standards, we have the standards, but one of the unique elements of these pre-K through 6 standards is that we have an issue where social studies is really one of the last priorities, and we were trying to create curriculum that would ease the pressure off of teachers so that we would get more social studies instruction. that's the reality. Now, how we get there is what we're looking at now. So I'm not so concerned as to how we get there. My concern is the process of how we get there. And this seems like a lot to digest. It is outside of the scope of what we normally do. I guess we have some examples. But if I may pose a question, why are we going to this committee of 3 board members instead of just running it through this standards and assessment?
Vice Chair Earl or Deputy Norman?
Yeah, I guess in looking at this, I'm looking at a time frame. This is just, as I looked at it last week when we said we can't go forward with the IAA. I'm looking at the time frame. I'm looking at the very thing you're saying, right? Getting the resources where we need them. To me, this sounds expedited. In other words, it can begin sooner than later. If we're going through standards and assessment, we may be talking a couple months before the RFP gets out and gets going. This type of a process allows individuals to start working on it by the end of tomorrow, right? That type of a thing. And so we've got the process underway. We've got people with eyes on it. We're not having to bring everything back every time in front of the board. So I just see it as a more expedited process to get to the very thing you're asking for, right? That gets the resources, additional resources where we want them.
May I follow
Follow
up?
up?
So in regards to that, what do we anticipate the timeline to be with this versus going through the committee? How will this expedite it? Because it still has to come back to the full board, right?
Do you want me to answer?
Question for
doesn't?
Deputy Norman or Vice Chair Earl?
Well, for starts, we don't have it on the agenda tomorrow, so then it would be March. Whereas if this were to move forward and we had individuals tomorrow put on the committee, then that could begin by the end of the week, right? So I guess if not, then it has to be put on for Marches, and then, do you see what I'm saying? And then would it come back before the board? Is that what we're suggesting? So then that would be another month out,
So I'm not quite certain, would it come back to the board based on this process, the full board?
Well, it would come back as the contract. When they've made a decision based on recommendations, based on the work that's done with staff, and they've picked a contract, it would come back before the board on a consent calendar.
Okay, so how would,
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure, yeah.
Deputy Norman, you want
Yeah.
to weigh in here on the process?
Yeah. And Adam, please, if I say it incorrectly, clarify. I'm good with that. It has to come back to the board because it is a contract that is over $100,000. So right now, we have in there $500,000 that can be put in there. There's an additional according to this motion. But because it is a contract over $100,000, it does have to come back to the board for approval.
That answered the question? Okay, we do have
Yes.
some more lights on.
just one last thing, I'm sorry.
one.
So, yep, that'll be
I'm
it.
just kidding.
So, one of the debates throughout Utah in regards to county commissions is many county commissions are 3 individuals. And that has often been referred to as the tyranny of 2. And I guess maybe that causes me just a little bit of angst.
Okay, is that, let's move. We got Member Davis, Member Bogus. I'll come back to Member Klein, but I want those that haven't spoken. I'm sorry, that's Member Davis, Bogus, Booth, and back to Klein.
One question and then probably a quick follow-up after that. Can you, Chair, can we find out from staff, what's the difference between this, a vendor process, and a grant process? What are the differences there and what are our choices?
Deputy Norman, that's Director Hurd.
Yeah, so I can speak to the contract process, but as far as grants, since they're not procurements, I'm not too familiar with that process. Though I think there are some similarities with a competitive grant. It would be conducted similarly to an RFP, where we would put together an application with certain criteria that we're looking for and certain requirements, and then LEAs would respond to that. It would be evaluated, and when they decided which one was the best, they would award that to them, to the LEA. Funds would be given to them, and kind of more, that's, I think, a more hands-off approach than the LEA develops everything. Whereas in a contract process, I think there's more involvement between USBE and the vendor.
Does that answer the question or follow up?
So in the contract process, we're looking at a vendor, but an LEA would not be a vendor. In a grant process, we'd have an LEA. LEAs would bid out to help write this. And in this process, vendors would vie for the contract.
Correct.
So why, okay, so the follow-up question is then, why did we move from wanting our LEAs to work together in an interagency agreement? Why did we move from the LEA space, who kind of knows our community values, over to the vendor space?
Is that a question for Deputy Norman?
Maybe that's
Or
a question
for-
for the motion maker.
For
I don't know.
Member Vice Chair Earl?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a clarifying remark before that. And if we could have Deborah come up as well, if that's okay, Chair.
Please, yes.
To speak to the grant process. My understanding of the grant process is that's different from the RFP process. Is the RFP process, the board still owns the material. And so it's basically the board's, the grant process, we're sending money out, and it's then the LEAs. And so Deborah can say it much better than I can.
Thank you, Deborah. Assistant Superintendent, wait, I keep watching titles.
Deborah Jacobson, Assistant Superintendent of Operations. Deputy Norman is correct. If we send it out, you can send it out as a competitive grant, and you can make those requirements on how that particular process runs, whether you have one LEA that represents and pulls in multiple LEAs to contribute in on it. If it's one LEA that participates to do the whole thing, you can still put requirements on there. But at the end of the day, the LEAs will own the curriculum. It's basically a process in allowing them to create something on behalf of themselves. They are not doing it they're not providing a service to the board.
Quick follow-up, which
Follow-up,
is, was
sure.
that what the interagency agreement was going to be prior? So it's exactly like what it was going to be.
Except not an interagency agreement.
Okay,
An interagency agreement would be someone providing a service on behalf of USBE, and we would then USBE would own that product.
in an interagency agreement.
So I don't know if I can, the point of the RFP was that was the original intent. The switch from an RFP to an IAA happened in the fall in Standards and Assessment meeting, where they said, well, let's go more for an IAA. So, and then realizing we couldn't do that, as last week, the intent was to try to do an expedited, how do we get to where we need to go to get the resources? It wasn't, to undermine anything. It was simply, how do we get there, and how do we get there quicker than having to come back and have major discussions over and over again, or in a committee or something? It was, how can we provide a framework to do what we need to at the resources, and then provide additional funding for that to be successful.
Okay, last follow-up, Chair. So, but I'm understanding we're moving to working with a company rather than an LEA in what's being suggested here. This is suggested through a company, not an LEA. But that isn't my follow-up.
That
that
would
right?
be accurate. That was the original intent throughout the summer until we got to fall. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So the intent was, that was the RFI, was to, what's it gonna cost to have a company do that? So, yes.
Okay, so my question about this is that, is the three-person committee just going to be looking at logistical parameters of an RFP that, because the board already voted that we're not gonna include anything that the board hasn't voted on in current standards, or is there gonna be content shaping this? If there's gonna be content at all involved in this, I would suggest it goes through standards and assessment in an open meeting process. If there's no content, just for an expedited process, and it's only logistical, then I would suggest I'd vote for this motion moving forward with this, depending on that answer.
Go to
Well,
Vice
the
Chair.
recommendations would be to help with the scope of the work. So, no, you can't change the standards. I mean, that's clear, right? But as was said within as we were going through the standards writing process, the components of that could be recommended. That's where recommendations may come in.
So substantive will be included.
Could be.
Concept- Okay, so then I'd probably not speak in favor of the committee, but rather the Standards and Assessment Committee.
Okay, members Bogus and Booth.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a couple clarifying questions, and honestly, I don't know who I'm directing them to. Does this involve pre-K or no? I don't have clarity on that in
The
my
current
mind.
motion does not. It would have to be amended if it involved pre-K.
Okay, thank
Someone would
you.
have to amend.
Okay, and then secondly, how are the board members on this committee chosen? Maybe that was mentioned and I missed
It
it?
is mentioned, but I will re-articulate. It would just be each committee, each of our committees, standards and assessment, each of those committees would pick someone, however they went about that tomorrow, to move that forward.
Okay, thank you.
Member Booth.
Just a question on what's the normal makeup of an RFP committee? I mean, I know that we're not usually involved as a board, but everyone else that is normally on an RFP committee ought to be there, I guess, with the addition of board members, so that we're not just reinventing the RFP committee approach that's already been working for generations.
Is that an Adam question?
Yeah, I'm happy
Thank
to
you.
answer that. The RFP committees are typically made up of the section staff, the subject matter experts. And yeah, I mean, like we've mentioned before, sometimes board members have been on the committees. We haven't had one to my knowledge that's made up of almost entirely board members, because it's usually section staff that do that.
So how many are there on a normal committee?
The procurement code requires a minimum of 3. I would say on average, probably 5 or so.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Any further discussion to that motion? I appreciate Deputy Norman working through this. Do we have, is that Member Straight or Member Earl?
That
Oh,
would
Lear,
be me.
excuse me.
That would be me.
Member
And I know I've spoken a couple times to this, so I apologize, but I feel like if we take 10 minutes now, maybe it'll save us hours. Here's my concern about the way this looks now, is unless we get exactly the right 3 people from the board, and I think it's distinctly possible for Brent's tyranny of 2, then it will turn into a contract that will be on the board's calendar in March, April, May, and it'll be pulled off, and we'll have another 2-hour discussion about what we don't like about that contract. And so I feel like it is loaded to sort of fail in terms of efficiency as well as in terms of balance. And help me believe that that's not the case.
Is that a question for Vice Chair Earl?
I don't know, the maker
So
of the motion
Carol, I guess
probably.
we could just ask, who do you want on the committee, and then we could put them on it. The point was, the reason why we did this is so that it could go to your committees. That's the point, is that I mean, I listened to the discussion last month. I think there was an hour discussion on, do we want this person? Do we want that? Do we want leadership? Do we not want leadership? So the intent wasn't to undermine or to, it was to create what
I
would
can
maybe
pick.
considered a
If you're
balance.
sincerely asking that, I'll
No,
give
but
you
that's
3
my
people.
point, is that your view, I guess I hear this a lot, that we need to have a little faith in our board members as board members. I think the reason for this is so that we can engage and have a group that can engage, and they're going to engage with staff on that. I would hope that they would be thoughtful. I could be wrong.
Balanced is the word I'm looking for.
But I hope
Balanced
they
is-
would be
I think
balanced.
everybody's
I'm not
thoughtful.
sure.
We're
yeah.
not all balanced, and especially in concert sometimes.
Okay. And I'll just comment that I'm currently a member of Finance, so we might have another opportunity to try to draft Chair Norton. I'm half joking. That was on, we tried that last month. So, well, okay. I think I understand the process. It goes to the 3 committees for discussion, and we may or may not be able to draft Chair Norton into that. Is Member Wood?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a quick question for Adam. As far as, so we're here trying to expedite a resource for our local aid, our LEAs. what's the normal process for an RFP? How long does it usually take for a quality RFP to be drafted and then presented and moved forth? What's the timing? And how would the grant process be different in terms of timing and in the end, which one will provide an expedited resource for our LEAs in the most efficient, positive way possible?
Sure, yeah. RFPs are kind of a long process. I would say on average, they're probably about 3 to 4 months, because there is some time on the front end to determine the scope of work, mandatory minimum requirements, technical criteria, all these things that the vendors are going to be evaluated on. And then we generally put an RFP out for 30 days, allow vendors 30 days to review it, compile their proposals and submit those. Then we get into the whole evaluation portion, which if we can have vendor presentations, which can add some time because it's just another stage in scheduling those. And then after that's all complete and we award the contract, then you have to go into the negotiation portion, which generally takes some time as well. So I would say a typical time frame is probably 3 to 4 months from start to actually contract execution. As far as the grant process, maybe Deborah can speak to that.
Thank you.
The grant, well, as far as the grant process is concerned, it varies. It really varies. It varies on the amount of requirements that you want to put on that funding source, whether or not the funding will be reimbursable or go out in a lump sum. It will take time for the competitive process if it's a competitive grant, where LEAs will have to apply, and then their applications will have to be vetted and then awarded from there. So there is, on the grant competitive side, it can vary on the application. We kind of can decide how long that application, they have to complete those applications. And then it's awarded from there, and then the LEA gets started.
Follow up.
Does that?
Follow up?
Yeah, just do you have any time, I mean, he said sometimes 3 to 4 months. Do you have any, a minimum time that you would say it never takes less than this?
I would say it probably wouldn't take less than 30 days for the LEA to actually start working on it if we awarded a grant.
Thank you.
Member, I think, Straight, Member Davis.
Yes, thank you. I'll be quick. I remember early on when I was on our city council, there was something in the planning commission, and I attended that meeting, and I even spoke in public comment. And the more I look back on that experience, it soon became evident that I was out of my lane and that I was putting myself in a situation that was not in the best interest of good discussion by the Planning Commission. An RFP is an administrative body. Its makeup and its structure and its processes are clearly defined. I believe that we would be stepping in the wrong direction to make this a common thing, and by doing it once, we now put ourselves in a new direction. So there's much I like about the ideas presented, but it's not our process. Now, if we want to look at changing our processes, that might be a discussion we would have, but not here. That would be later. So thank you.
Thank you, Member Straight. Member Davis.
So do I understand correctly that whether we go through the RFP, which would take 4 months-ish, or a grant, which could get started as soon as 1 month-ish, either way, the materials will end up in open commons, which means that any LEA can use the material and alter it to meet its own community needs and standards. Am I understanding that correctly?
No.
Okay.
Deputy Norman.
And correct me if I'm wrong, because these are my teachers right here. And that is, if it goes through the grant process, USB is not the owner. The owner of is the LEA, which could then put it into open commons, and any LEA would be able to change it. If it goes through the RFP process and John Smith Publishing pulls it up, it could be a different process unless it was specified in the contract that it is then USBE's property that they can do with it as they want. So that would need to be specified in the contractual obligations.
So follow up.
Yes.
The grant process would create no copyright with the LEA. The RFP vendor process could create a copyright with the vendor. Okay, I'd like to make a substitute
Mr.
motion,
Earl?
Chair.
Did you have a
Well,
response to
unless
the
that
question?
is part of the contract.
Okay, I'd like to make a substitute motion, Chair.
Okay.
I move that we appropriate the same funds as just discussed for a grant process.
Is there a second? Want to speak to the motion by Chair Davis?
Well, everything I'm hearing tells me that we can, the timeline, we're working on efficiency, the timeline would be sooner. We'd start within a month rather than 4 months. And instead of having a company, we'd have folks that are here for sure in Utah, already knowing and dealing with the issues that we deal with here in Utah. And quickly, I just talked to a principal this morning who said, we have made our own curriculum in certain areas because we want to make sure that we are approaching this student-based, not looking at hot topic buttons necessarily that we know are going to be against legislative resolutions or board rules and things like that. And they know kind of how to move forward. So it just, and ultimately, there's not going to be a copyright. And maybe we need to put in the RFP contract, whether we go either way, that it goes into open commons and there's not a copyright, and then our LEAs can use this. Carol's nodding her head like legally that's not going to be possible. But the whole reason we're doing this is so any LEA can use this material and alter it the way it needs to meet its own community standards. So if it's not going to be likely, why are we doing this at all if they all can't use it? It's not going to go into open commons.
So I have a related question. If it's an RFP, we've been talking about companies, would that be open to LEAs, universities, nonprofits? I mean, what's the scope of people who can apply through an RFP? Is that for Director Hurd?
Yeah, so I don't think an LEA could respond because, we don't contract with them. But a university certainly could. We've had universities respond to our RFPs before and be considered for contracts.
So it could be inside, outside, private, nonprofit,
Sure.
just not an LEA, just not a subdivision of the state. Okay.
Correct.
Any other question, or Member Davis?
Director Rasmussen just said that we already have something in provisions that says if it's created with board funds, it does go into open commons and it can be used by any LEA to be used for their needs.
Would that be for either in the grant or an RFP?
May I, Chair?
Yes, please.
Ben Rasmussen, Director of Law and Professional Practices. So we have R277120, which talks about this, and it specifically says that the superintendent shall share public education materials developed with funds controlled by the board under a CCBY license. That means that anybody can use those as long as they basically provide attribution to the board. They can use them, share them, adapt them. They just have to provide attribution to the board.
So would that mean then that either an RFP or a grant process, whatever was produced there, would be subject to open sharing and could not be restricted by copyright?
I think the RFP process, with the RFP process following that rule, it would be subject to that license. I'm not sure how the grant process, how that would play into it, because you're just giving the money to someone else, and then that wouldn't be funds controlled by the board anymore.
I see. Under the grant process, it wouldn't be controlled. The RFP would be determined by the terms of the contract then? Okay, which could restrict or not, but that would be up to the RFP process. Okay. All right, we need to sort of move, but Member
Scott
Lear.
said no.
Do we have new, I'm sorry.
I've
Deputy
spoken.
Jones has
I
a question
just- I'll be
or a
brief.
correction.
Your point was just quickly made. The vendor, under an RFP process, would have to agree to that. And my experience is that it be an open source. And my experience is that a vendor is unlikely to spend millions of dollars and lots of time working with us and say, oh, sure, anybody can have it, anybody can adapt it, anybody can do anything they want, and we'll still call it Pearson. That's not been my
So-
experience that vendors do that.
That may be something, Deputy Jones. I mean, I think the intent here is that we're paying them for the development, not necessarily for the copyright. I could be wrong, but is that not part of the deal here, is that we're not paying you for a product you can put on the open market, but rather something that we will pay you for and then share? I don't know, Deputy Jones, I'm floundering here,
all right.
but feel free.
Okay, Deputy Superintendent of Operations Scott Jones, 2 points of clarification. If you go with the grant process, that money is controlled by the board, managed by the LEA. So they are subrecipients of our money. So I just want to make that point. If you go by way of a grant process, then you need to decide, please, I'm asking please, I don't telling you what to do, but please decide whether or not you want it to be a competitive grant or just an open grant to whoever you deem could be participants by the LEA. That would help us immensely with the timing of this too. If you decide to go with an RFP, LEAs do not compete for contractual obligations with us or for us. So my understanding was this was designed or intended to go to a company, so the RFP process is better than that. It doesn't mean you still can do or have LEA participation as well, but if you want a vendor to do this, please follow the RFP process. That concludes my point, subject to any questions or concerns, and I look better than Brian up here. No, go ahead.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Deputy Jones.
So anyway, all right, thank you. So
All
I'll
right.
sit down. Thank you.
All
I'll
right.
be here all day, though.
Any final comments? We do need, I think we're officially about 100 minutes, I think, behind, so. Oh, you're on, sorry. Vice Chair Hart, and then over to Member Bogus, and then we need to.
So I think we've lost the point of this. So as a practitioner, when I first came to Utah, there were science materials that you could purchase from the state, and they aligned directly with the standards. And they were about $3 a book if you wanted them printed, or you could just download them and use them. When it came to the social studies standards, and they are so specific to Utah, and then in addition to concerns that perhaps we never would find the perfect curriculum that made it through the rigorous curriculum vetting standards that we have, I believe the districts were interested, the superintendents were interested in materials being provided. That's how we got here. So now we need to figure out how to provide those resources. I was on the assessment RFP. I've here for choosing the assessment materials. That is not out of line. That's something that I've done in many districts. It doesn't mean that the board members are running the show. It just means they're a participant. The whole team is walking into that as a board member. I'm fully aware that the professionals in the room are smarter than I am at this. I just am representing the board at that time with input and making sure that there's communication between the two bodies. I think we've gone way beyond sticking to what we're trying to get accomplished here. We're trying to get materials in the hands of our practitioners. We're trying to do it quickly. We're trying to make sure that it addresses the standards so our teachers aren't scrambling and guessing at what we meant by the standards or what we intend, or trying to give those elementary teachers in particular a little bit more time, a little bit more resources that save them time. We can debate all day long and get into hidden agendas or whatever, but at the end of the day, we need materials for our teachers. So we need to not lose sight of where we're trying to go and just make a decision.
Thank you. Member Bogus, I think we're ready for a vote after that.
Okay, so Chair, you can totally say that we're not answering this question, just so you know. But I am struggling with how there seems to be multiple definitions of the word adaptation coming from members of the board. Because as an educator, adaptation in the classroom is very different from adaptation of a copyright work. And so when they're talking about copyright versus non-copyright, that means completely different things. And as I hear people speak, I'm not certain we're all using that word with the same definition. And we can totally not answer this question, but if it helps us reach a point of voting, that would be helpful for me.
Is there somebody who'd like to answer that question? I'm not sure where adaptation, it's not in the motion, but I know it's been thrown around in discussion. Do you have a specific reference?
Specifically, when Member Lear was talking about copyright and that people don't tend to give that away. It's tend to be something they want, they don't let it go. And then we talked about developing a curriculum for the purposes of adaptation in the classroom. Well, as an educator, when I adapt things in my classroom, I don't change the fundamental work itself, but adaptation, according to copyright, is a derivative work of, and to me, I just don't think we're using that word the same out of everyone's mouth, and it would be helpful for me to understand what people mean by the word adaptation. And maybe this is a rabbit trail, and you're welcome to shut me down.
Well, I think it's an important question without going into, it's been a while since I litigated a copyright case, and I'm not even going to try. I'm not even going to try, but I think your question is, you know, does one or the other of these raise the risk that as an LEA takes the material and does something with it, it raises that possibility that you're into a copyright contest? Is that, might basically get, the adaptation within the pedagogical curriculum question is one thing. I think you're talking about which of these binds us in the sense that people can't try to adapt it without running into legal risk. Am I?
Yes.
Okay, anybody?
That's my question.
Deputy, and if I butchered it, I think I did.
To be honest, I just.
We're talking about adaptation within the context of control over the final product, right?
Yes.
That's the question? Okay.
I believe so, but I just think members are using that word in two different veins, and
Right.
maybe I'm wrong in my listening and processing that information, but I just want clarity so that I understand. Maybe I'm confused,
Deputy
sorry.
Norman, I think she'll
So
help us
I
both.
am not copyright law at all. I'm just throwing that out there. Ben is still in the room somewhere. But I think I'm understanding your question. The original intent, going back to what the LEAs were asking for, the board has control over standards. The LEAs decide the curriculum. And then in the classroom, with, you know, support from an administrator, families and parents, is about the delivery of instruction, how it's delivered in the classroom. And so if what the original intent was, because LEAs are the ones who decide the curriculum would be placed up there, but an LEA, according to their context, when they're trying to adopt it into their building, would still have to go through their formal process of curriculum adoption. They might find something in there that's objectionable to them, or they might want to add something in it as well. So they would have that open copyright if it's placed in an RFP and the vendor agrees to it, or if it's in the grant process through the Commons. They would be able to then adapt it to their own LEA-specific needs, and then, of course, moving down to the adaptation in the classroom that you're talking about, the method of delivery to their own students, then that is something different than I think the being able to adjust some of those lesson plans and materials that an LEA can consider upon adoption.
Okay, may I follow
ask
up
the question?
just
Yeah, sure.
smoking fast?
You bet.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, we can deliver this RFP process, and the adaptation process is to either add to or remove from, but not change.
That would be an LEA's decision. That wouldn't be the decision of the board either way, because they're not over curriculum. Unless this curriculum was mandated that this is the only curriculum someone could use. And so that would have to be whatever the intent of the board is. But if the intent is to provide an initial seed of, here's this curriculum, we have the framework, we have everything in here, and then according to the local context as they're deciding the curriculum. So that would be something that usually there's not a mandated curriculum.
Okay, thank you,
I
ma'am.
think Superintendent Dixon might, nope. Oh, okay, you are Superintendent Dixon. You spoke. Thank you, Superintendent Dixon. Okay. Does that answer the question? I think there's questions about the role of board districts and schools, and then there's also questions about control over a product and whether it's a copyright issue, right? And so that's, I hope we've addressed both of those. Member Davis? Or-
Can you
I'm
come back to
sorry,
me
Member Wood?
after the others?
And then I have a comment.
Single question, are there LEAs who would like to do this before we vote on Member Davis's substitute? Do we have them waiting in line? Okay, thank you.
Back to Member Davis or Member Earl, Vice Chair Earl?
Yeah, I just would vote against this motion. That's what I think, putting it out for the RFP and going through that process and then putting in the requirements there, I think would be beneficial. Anyways.
Okay, we have a motion. The motion on the floor is.
Can I, just point of order, without objection, it's been asked that that be defined as a competitive grant process, not an open grant process. So can we just make sure that's clear? And Director Norman, read your cell phone because I have a question for you. I don't want to take up more time.
Think that would be a question about the different processes for Director Hurd. Yeah, RFP or grant processes.
Can I speak to the motion, Chair
Sure.
Mullins? Because we've had a suggestion, and I kind of want to throw it out there in case we need to put an amendment to this amendment. But there is an idea that's been thrown out here that we move forward with an RFP with a vendor and use T&L money to pay LEAs to participate and write in the contract that the vendor will work with our LEAs to create the content. And they would be paid similar, their subs and such would be paid to participate like we do now for other projects.
I'm sorry, is that a recommendation
It's
that
a-
goes into the motion or
It's
speaking
a,
to the motion?
I'm speaking to potentially changing the motion if there's any traction. If not, then I just move forward and vote.
Is this a suggestion for the maker of the underlying motion? A question for Vice Chair
I mean,
Earl?
it could be a
or what's
combination of the two, is all I'm thinking of.
Could you state that again? And we could have a.
Well, I'm not necessarily making a substitute motion because I don't want to take everyone's time unless there's a
Well,
little traction.
You have
I'm-
the substitute motion on the floor, so I guess the question is whether there's an
Whether
amendment to the
amend this
substitute
up.
motion.
Right.
Correct.
So the suggestion is that we move forward on an RFP with a vendor and use T&L money to pay LEAs, teachers, administrators to participate. And we've done this with other projects that we've done in the past. It would pay for substitutes and things of that nature.
So maybe we can articulate, pay them to.
Work with the vendor. So if I'm understanding,
them
you're
to-
saying,
okay, go ahead.
you're saying that the RFP would include in it, this would be a recommendation for the RFP, right? That it would include in it that whoever the entity is would work with educators that wanted to engage in doing the process. Is that what I'm understanding?
It was just asked by someone here that said, why not do both? Why not do both of these?
So the RFP would be.
We have the money to
Would
do
be an
both.
entity, it could be UVU, I'm just throwing this out because they're engaged in some of this process already, who could be contracting with our educators in order to do that. Is that,
They wouldn't contract with the educators. We would stipulate in the contract that they would use members from our LEAs to help with the writing and help with the crafting of the curriculum.
In the RFP process, are you,
Speaking,
We'd write that into the contract.
in an RFP, we have a grant?
But for now, for the money, I mean, we need to decide if we want to use resources to do that.
But just to clarify the motion or the amendment to the substitute motion, the amendment would be to engage in the RFP process, but specify in any contract in the RFP that the recipient vendor would use Utah LEA educators in the process of developing that curriculum. Something to that effect?
Correct.
Okay, so that's an amendment to the substitute motion. Does that have a second?
second.
It's been seconded.
I don't understand what that means, sorry.
Well, now we can have discussion to the motion. So we've got an amendment to the substitute motion, and now we have discussion or questions to that amendment. Vice Chair Earl.
I would actually recommend we vote down this, we go with the RFP process that was outlined and allow those very recommendations, which we could put it in there as well if we wanted to stipulate that here, that we use, that we make that available, right? That's part of the process, whoever's going to submit this or do it would work with educators. I think that's a great idea. That, to me, becomes part of the recommendations, I guess, is what I'm thinking, and I could see that.
Yeah, it would just take funds, though. We'd have to agree that because we'd have to pay them for their substitutes and such.
The funds
Out of
would be,
probably out of the TNL funds, which is what we just put in the motion up there.
so the funding would be additional funds beyond what is appropriated to the potential RFP to support LFAs or LEAs in participating. Deputy Jones.
I would recommend, as your comptroller, that you don't specify necessarily that it come from TNL, that we just get the funds, okay?
Okay.
I mean, just not to rope us in there, so. Is that
Okay.
okay? Yeah.
Then we won't
Thank you.
specify.
I look good up here.
All right, we have, do we have
I have another clarifying
the
question.
amendment on the floor to the substitute motion? And I don't want to clarify to the maker of the motion, Member Davis. I understand that this would be actually an amendment to the RFP process, whereas your substitute motion was to switch it to a grant process. Am I
I'm
hearing that
amending my
correctly?
substitute motion,
Right.
that it be an RFP
Okay.
process with with educators helping to create the curriculum.
Okay, so I just to get it correct.
After the RSP
before
is
we-
granted and
Right,
with the standards that we have voted on.
okay. So do we have that on the board? That this is provided in the RFP contract, I believe. Member Davis, am I getting that right?
No,
Say that one more time.
We would say provide in the RFP contract.
no.
No? I thought we were referring to an
Yes.
RFP. Okay, so in the RFP contract, your substitute was a grant. This switches it back to an RFP, but with these specifications, right? Okay. So the amendment to the substitute is an RFP process with money to LEAs. Do we have that up there? Okay. Does that accurately state the amendment to the substitute
Yeah,
motion?
is it understood that the educators would engage after the RFP has been awarded? That's the understanding, then there's a concern
so
here
it's
that.
not so much that and I'm sorry if I'm violating Robert's rules, it's not so much they would participate in the grant process, they would participate in the development of the curriculum
Correct,
with any vendor receiving the award.
correct.
Okay. So can we put
And
that
do-
in there?
Yeah.
We'll come
I'm
back to
okay,
the
but I
second.
have
Let's state the motion.
clarifying
Wi-
All right, let's get the motion up there. So we have,
Oh, we need to take out grant process because it wouldn't be a grant to have the educators
Right.
participate. Also, we previously voted with no additional standards. Do we need to put that into this also, or do we not need to include that?
You
I-
can't,
that's
With
I
no
don't know that we
changes to
can
our
legally
standards.
do additional standards.
Or sorry, with no changes to our standards.
I think that
We
was
can't
already in the
change.
motion that authorized
I
the
think it was
steps
too.
that we're now
Okay.
considering, right?
But you can't
So that,
change the standard.
no, but we put that in the original motion that authorized the steps we're now debating. So that's in there. And so what we need is the vendor would engage, the vendor awarded the RFP or something to that effect would engage with LEAs in the development of the curriculum. Okay. Does that look right, Member Davis?
Will you read it one more time out loud? Because there's so many
Says-
things on the board.
Right, this would say, the amendment to the substitute would say, the board add another step to the process, provide in the RFP contract that the vendor would engage with LEAs, educators who would serve as content writers for the curriculum. Does that accurately state the motion, or the amendment to the substitute?
Yes, so we would write into the contract. Yes. There's a
Okay.
concern here that educators would be part of the RFP, but they would come in after.
Right. Which I think, is that reflected, let's see.
Well, I think it'd be
Yeah,
on public
okay,
record. I
that
think.
seems to get
No,
the
let-
cart and the horse correctly. So is that, who had the second? Member Laird, does that, does your
It
second still
does,
apply?
But I still have a clarifying question.
Okay, as long as we have the second, then we can move
Yes,
to
we
discussion,
do have a
clarifying
second.
questions. All right,
So
Member
I'm
Lear and Member Wood.
I'm trying to put these two together. So now we would not have board members, would the board members still participate in the RFP process? Under this substitute?
To the maker or to Vice
The
Chair Earl?
maker, to the substitute maker.
Member Davis. So the substitute motion.
Has no board members.
Has no
This
board member.
amendment to the substitute would be in replacement of the original motion that
Right.
defined the committee and board members. So my understanding is the substitute does not reference board members.
That's right.
Correct.
So,
Okay.
and that's the way you intended it.
No, I would not.
It would just go through the regular RFP process.
But at the back end, educators would participate in developing the curriculum with the vendor. Is that right?
Yes. I
Okay.
mean,
Yes.
So discussion to the amendment to the substitute then.
Okay, I support that, yes. I'm
Okay,
second.
Vice Chair Earl.
Yeah, so you're anticipating this being, I guess in my mind, this contract's going to come back to us, even if it passes, right? And now we've got a 2-hour discussion when it comes back, because we'll be looking and saying, did this, what? Did it meet what the expectations of board members? And that was the point of the board members. So if we leave that out, then once again, we run the same risk as before.
I
So,
guess
All right, hold
for me,
on. Robert's
just be
rules.
doesn't match the
Hold on.
standards.
Hold on. Robert has re-entered the building. Who's the light up? Member Wood.
Speaking to the motion.
Okay, thank
Is
you.
this a natural, do we have vendors who will actually agree to this in a contract that they will work with? I mean, we're talking about companies here who have their,
Deputy Norman?
Yeah, and I would like to ask maybe Assistant Superintendent Jacobson, because in the, our assessment contract, we did contract with a vendor who did work with Utah teachers in developing test item questions. They did belong to the state of Utah, and they were not then shown out to the public as well. So she may be able to provide more information on that.
Assistants.
That would be
Deborah.
accurate, yes.
okay,
They-
so
they
that
do
this
have-
isn't a questionable process, this could happen and that there are people who work. for it.
Correct.
Perfect, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Before we do a motion, before we do a vote.
Chair?
Okay. All right, we need are we asking for 5?
No, we just got one technical change. Go ahead, Ben.
So I think the concern is that if this is an amendment to the substitute motion, as you see on your screen, deals with a grant. It would be appropriate to have this be an amendment to the original motion, because that deals with an RFP, but the substitute motion is dealing with a grant.
Right, so because that changes from grant to RFP, that's inappropriate. Okay. Another amendment to take it back to an RFP? Right. Okay, so that's a significant enough change that it is in conflict.
can I make a different substitute motion? So it's,
Well, we've got, your substitute was on the floor. The amendment was offered, but I guess we're hearing from. So this amendment, adding an RFP, would not supersede the underlying substitute motion's grant language. We can't replace that with an amendment. Okay. So we do have a process. We have an amendment to a substitute on the floor. Okay, all right, so we're not changing, we're just adding. That cannot change the underlying. All right, so here we are. I think we have clarity. Thank you, Sybil. So the process is we do have an amendment to the substitute motion on the floor. The amendment is in conflict with the substitute, so if the amendment is approved, it would require another amendment to carry in the effect of the amendment. Is that clear as mud? Okay. Let's do that. Okay. All right, we do have an amendment to the substitute motion on the floor. The amendment is that the board, did you have another comment before we proceed to the vote, Deputy Norman? I wasn't sure if you had another comment. We were about to read the motion and take a vote on the amendment to the substitute. Unless you had further comment.
Yeah, I have no,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, let's give this a shot. The Board Member Davis's amendment to her substitute motion is that the board add another step to the process to provide in the RFP contract that the vendor would engage with LEAs, educators who would serve as content writers for the curriculum. All in favor of that motion, please raise your hands.
Are we trying to vote down the grant thing?
It's up to you what you want to vote up or down.
What are we voting on? Just that
All right,
the
the-
vendor will use educators to help write the thing.
Yes, as an amendment to the substitute motion. That is what's on the floor for vote. So all in favor of raising their hands. What do we have? This is the amendment to the substitute. Okay, so now we add that amendment to the substitute motion as amended, but we are now open if there is an amendment to that substitute. Hold on. That's what I think we were. Yeah. Right. And if there's an amendment to that, we can do that. Okay, so let's get the substitute in there with, as amended, if we could. Let's see. Well, the amendment goes to the substitute, which was pending. Right, sub is amended. There we go. Yep.
Point of order.
We need the language that was just approved added to the substitute that was previously sitting there. Is that there? Okay, all right.
It's in conflict, though.
It's in conflict, was pointed out by the parliamentarians. So if somebody wants to resolve the conflict, it would require another amendment to the substitute motion right
So
now to
moved.
resolve that conflict.
So moved.
Is there a particular amendment you'd like to make to clean this up?
You would
then?
strike, grant, and insert RFP.
Okay.
Strike
that part?
competitive grant and insert RFP.
There we go. Get that up there, and can we, all right, so the motion to amend the substitute motion is to strike the words competitive grant in the language above and instead insert RFP, which would change the substitute to say that the board approves $400,000 from state discretionary funds and $400,000 from mineral release funds for an RFP process and provide in the RFP contract that the vendor would engage with LEAs, educators who would serve as content writers for the curriculum. So that is the proposed amendment to the substitute. And I think we had a second? We did have a second. Okay. Any discussion to that motion to amend? All right.
I'm sorry, is it still Grant?
Sorry? We got a second, Member Wood. Is that all making sense now? Can we do that in the language up there, like highlight the language that we would be changing? That's probably easier. So, for an RFP, there we go. We'd highlight that as being deleted, highlight RFP as being added, right? Yes. There we go. All right. Okay, any discussion of that, Member Bogus?
Just a quick question. Is this $400,000 in addition to or included in the original motion?
This is a substitute motion, meaning that it replaces the prior motion. If this fails, we go back to the original. So what's currently before us is to amend the substitute motion as highlighted, to delete a competitive grant and add an RFP process. That's the proposed amendment to the substitute. If that passes, then we will vote on the substitute. If that fails, we will go back to the original motion. I think. Okay. All right, so that's the motion on the floor. Is Board Member Davis's motion to amend to strike a competitive grant and insert an RFP. All in favor, please raise your hand. Noes. So how many votes in favor? I don't think we had a hand up here, did we? No yeses up here, so. Right, right. Just count the hands that were up. All right, let's do.
Point of order, we didn't get a chance to speak on this amendment.
Oh, I thought I invited it and maybe nobody. Member Davis.
I'd like to speak to the amendment. This, I think, hopefully gives folks some of what they want or need. Those that want to work with a company or through a university or the Constitutional Studies Department or whatever would have a body to work from, and they would also include input from our LEAs and our educators and our boots on the ground. This is intended as trying to move forward in a way that can include some of both.
Okay, any further discussion to the amendment to the substitute motion? Member Reel.
I have a question for staff. Are we aware of vendors that provide this type of work? Well, yeah, the only applicable vendor I can think of is a college or university within the state, like the College of Education from somewhere that says we're going to take this grant money and work with LEAs, but there aren't any private companies that you're aware of that does this kind of work?
The responses to the RFI that we originally sent out, there were only a couple that gave bids. The others said we would have to see the scope of work before we even hazard a guess. So from what I have seen come in response to the RFI, there aren't any that would do this for the amount that we're able to offer. But I mean, that's my limited experience. Yeah.
All right, any further discussion to the amendment to the substitute? Okay, do we need a roll call, Sybil, or should we do a raise of hands? All right.
Is it possible to withdraw the motion considering that information? Now that it's on the floor?
We'd have to vote it down in order to.
And then would it go back to a
Remove
competitive
it.
grant?
It would go back to a competitive grant on the substitute motion, then we'd have to vote on
And
that.
we would still pay other educators to participate with the LEA that gets the competitive grant?
Correct. The substitute motion was a
Got
competitive
it.
grant while paying the LEA to develop any curriculum. Right.
And they would use other educators. We would pay other educators to participate based on the,
Whatever's in the substitute there. Providing the RFP contract that they would engage with LEAs. We did not have in the substitute how they'd be paid. So, we ready to vote on the amendment to the substitute? All in favor of the amendment to the substitute motion, which is to strike competitive grant and insert RFP. All in favor, please raise your hands. Five in favor.
I mean, I'm being told it's not going to be feasible.
So, we had 8 hands up? I saw 5 hands up. We had 5 hands up. Let's just count the yays. We had 5 hands up. Those are the yays. Lear, okay. Did we get the yays? Let's count the yays. The noes didn't raise their hands. Oh. That did not? Let's do this again, folks. Yays, please raise your hands. What's that? Okay. Well, right. So hold on. Let me just try to get Robert back in here. So we have a motion on the floor. We need to vote. If board members are informed of something that changes your vote based on feasibility or anything else, they can vote accordingly. But we need to take a vote on the amended motion to the substitute. So
What somebody has said that might affect that vote.
do we not know, Member Davis? Oh, okay.
We just heard from
Okay.
staff a minute ago that said that it would be unlikely to almost impossible that a vendor would agree to this process for this price and include educators. And our lowest bid so far was $7 million when we were looking at this from companies. So understanding those realities a little better, that's why I'm choosing not to vote for my own amendment and going back to the competitive grant.
Understood. That's what we heard. Right, okay, I'm sorry, I thought everybody heard that. So with that information, all in favor, please raise your hand. What are we voting on? We're voting on the amendment to the substitute, which is to strike competitive grant and insert RFP. All right, let's do a roll call.
No, we're not voting for the grant.
We're just voting to strike grant and insert RFP, taking into account the information we just heard from Member Davis. All right, so Member Bogus. Member Booth.
No.
Member Klein. No. Member Davis.
No.
Vice Chair Earl. No. Member Green. No. Vice Chair Hart.
No.
Member Hymas.
No.
Member Carey. No. Member Lear. No. Member Norton. No. Member Reel. No. Member Straight. No. Member Wood. No. And Member Moss is a no. So that amendment fails. We are back to the substitute, which is and I believe that is now unamended, correct? The substitute has not been amended.
There is an amendment.
We did include the amendment to add the LEAs. Okay. So this is the amended substitute from the prior amendment. That the board approves $400,000 from state discretionary funds and $400,000 from mineral release funds for a competitive grant process.
Providing the grant.
Well, all right, we got to, that was how it was stated. So, okay. I will invite any amendments that anybody might want to make to the substitute motion.
Can I ask a question about
Member Davis?
now what's compiled to be my own motion? Is this amendment to include the educators and the LEAs needed now if it's going to be an LEA competitive grant?
Question for
And is
Assistant
there any
Superintendent
precedent
Jacobson,
where that has
perhaps?
happened, where we've paid for an LEA to create the curriculum or a combination of LEAs, and then they have included other educators?
Is that a question
Because
for Superintendent?
we don't need
is
it, we're gonna
Superintendent
take it out.
Jacobson or Deputy Norman? Who's the best subject matter expert for that one?
I can answer. I
Assistant
think.
Superintendent Jacobson?
Board Member Davis, can you repeat your question? So I'm sure.
I mean, my question is just, do we need to have, is there any precedent where we've done an RFP with an LEA and then included or paid from a different account other LEAs to participate and help?
In this, but we would not do an RFP process with LEAs.
Sorry, a competitive grant.
Oh, okay. So yes, we have done grants before where they've basically created a group from other LEAs to create different things. I mean, it is possible to do
Okay.
that, yes.
Then let's move forward and then we can create those those parameters in the contract to the extents.
Well, I'm kind of
Or I
inviting
would.
amendments. We have some contradictory language. Is there an amendment? Well, hold on, we're gonna, is any further discussion or amendment to the substitute, or are we ready to vote?
Well, you said you were inviting amendments, and I'm
You-
responding to your.
I'm sorry, your light's not working, Member Lear, I apologize, I'm just not seeing you. I'm sorry, Member Hart's having trouble seeing it too. We're not trying to ignore you.
Oh,
It's a
I don't
short.
feel bad. I'm not.
It's a
I'm-
short in the light, so, sorry, go ahead.
Totally don't feel bad. Yes, it does need to be amended, and we're looking at the blue, right?
Yes.
Okay, Jenny, would you mind moving a little bit to your left? Oh, the board approves 400,000 from state and 400 million for a competitive grant process, and provide in the process that the grantee would engage with LEA educators who would serve as content writers for the curriculum. So do you mind?
So that's the amendment.
That's
Can we
my
track that
amendment.
in the language? So this is effectively switching from RFP to grant. Can we track that in the? Okay. Okay.
Yes, if the thing stop, and,
It would be, yeah. go
for a
ahead.
competitive grant process, and provide in the process, instead of RFP contract.
Can we track that in the body of the existing motion? Is
Yeah.
that trickier?
Is
I'm
that
not
too
sure who's
hard?
driving.
Right.
Right, you're right.
Provide
Sorry,
in
sorry,
the,
Ben.
in the process, instead of RFP contract. You're totally ruining my view.
I thought it was improving upon. I guess Scott needs to come up.
It's like Scott and Brian, you know, who is cuter, the words or Jenny? In the process that
There we
the
go.
vendor would engage with the LEAs, with LEA educators. So you can get rid of the S and the paren, who would serve as content writers for the curriculum. Oh, would engage with that the grantee would engage, not the vendor, yes, with LEA educators who would serve as content writers for the curriculum.
Are we able to highlight process and grantee somehow? Is that possible, Ben? Sorry. We got the deletions right. I just want to make sure that we have the additions clear. There we go.
Would engage with educators.
All right, does that reflect the motion, Member Lear?
Yes, it does.
Okay, is there a second to that amendment to the substitute?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any discussion to the amendment to the substitute motion?
Oh,
Deputy Jones, did you have comments on this one? I thought I saw you earlier, but maybe I didn't. Member Lear?
I'll speak to it briefly. It's pretty
Oh, please do, I'm sorry.
It's pretty self-evident, but if we don't have a vendor, if it's a competitive grant process, we have a grantee, and LEAs would then participate in the writing of the curriculum. I'm not sure LEA educators who would serve as content writers, it feels more like it should, now I'm questioning my own, I gave up my choice to, here's my concern, that probably staff would work with educators as content writers for the curriculum. It doesn't feel like that LEA educators would singularly or jointly serve as content writers for the curriculum. Am I being more, is that more practically accurate, Deputy Norman?
Deputy Norman?
In clarifying your question, you're asking if we have the teachers or LEA staff, right, then we would oversee it.
I was more thinking USBE staff would work with LEA educators who would jointly serve as content writers for the curriculum. Is that more practically how it would work?
We would still need someone that would be overseeing the body of it. So right now, we don't have staff that are curriculum writers, but that's their expertise is in the area.
You could appoint somebody.
You could appoint someone. You could appoint someone outside as well. So I think that it could work either way to your question. So I'm just trying to think of staff time. We would probably need to hire an FTE to help with that process of bringing all those people together. So curriculum writing is one of my background areas, and I did it for 5 years in Davis with all, different areas of this. So it would depend on the scope of work from the board. It would depend on the level of access and involvement that would go along as well. So that would need to be articulated.
Would you feel like, maybe this is a question for the body, does this motion then allow for that flexibility to find the right supervisor? Because I don't expect that LEA educators are just going to come together sui sponte. Sorry, I'm not giving many chances to do that. And write curriculum.
And
Sorry.
That would be sui generis for just this one time, right?
Erase it locator to you too.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah.
Deputy Norman.
So that was my point in that last piece, is there would need to be someone that gathers them together. They're not just going to all of a sudden
direct their work.
and
blah,
direct
blah,
the
blah,
work
blah.
and make sure that it follows whatever that is. So whoever that is, I don't know that we have the capacity right now for staff to engage in that full committed effort, but we do have other people that might. And in looking at all of these processes, and if I may just speak to this, as I was talking with Deputy Jones as well back there, is it's talking about the RFP, it's talking about the grant, it's talking about different things. And I think to Vice Chair Hart's recommendation is to pick a process, and if no one applies for the RFP, then you move to the next process of a grant, or either or, if the grant, whatever that is. But maybe in trying to make this decision, there are unknowns and there are some trust things that are going to have to occur as a board to be able to get to a decision. So either way, if you go through the grant process, the RFP process, then that would be something that if a vendor comes in and no one can do it, then we have the answer for the grant as well.
Right, and Chair Moss, can I speak? I was not looking for that much depth. I was just saying, is the language of that motion now, does it have enough flexibility in it to accommodate what would really happen, which would include finding the right person to, okay, that's all, finding the person to manage those LEA educators, okay.
Quick question from me. Deputy Jones, do you have any input on this process as described? Does this raise any concerns procedurally, or is this all feasible?
No. So as a primary staff member, I just recommend, or I want to say 3 words: trust the process. Honor Board Member Earl's motion to do the RFP process, co-joined with Board Member Davis. We don't know what we don't know, and I get that our RFI process was what it was, but then as Dr. Norman described so well that I can't articulate as well as she does, within the process are safeguards against anything. You will know, if we don't get a bid, right, then we can go to the next step. But you're honoring what the first motion was, to do the RFP. Then we can make the decisions on that too. I know it doesn't say that in here, but if you go RFP co-joined with, LEA input to, if it gets to that point where somebody's selected, or if the RFPs come in and there's a certain amount of money, then we can decide, the board can decide if you want to apply more funding to it, and then we can identify those sources. It's right there. Trust the process that's been laid out for you, and then let's see what happens, right? If there's no bid, then you have another step, right? You have other processes that you can take to get to where you want to go. So does that help, sir?
Yes, thank you. I just
Okay.
want to specify that this does not go into Member Earl's underlying motion. It would replace it.
I thought hers was
That
the
would
RFP.
disappear.
Well, okay, yes, sir.
Correct.
Okay, I'm
Member-
not the procedures, but my understanding of her original motion was an RFP
Correct.
element. So
Yes,
you're
this would be a
honoring that
substi-
one?
This
Yep.
would
You
be a
replaced
substitute
it
for that.
to a
and so-
competitive grant.
Right. This would
Okay.
do, instead, what's currently here is all we would have. If this passes, the underlying motion for Member Earl goes away. We have
Okay.
a competitive grant process, which would include a requirement that the grantee engage with the LEA educators to serve as content writers. That would be the final, and I'm curious whether that raises any procedural issues. Is that?
No, I mean,
That's fine.
we can do a competitive grant, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right,
Okay,
thank
I
you,
get it.
sir.
Thanks, sir.
Okay. So we have lights. Let's see. We've heard from Member Lear. I think we went there. We've got Member Straight, Member Booth.
Me?
Members,
no, Member
yes,
Straight?
Member Straight, turn the light off.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I'm just wondering if we hadn't had this big discussion, what would staff have done? Or what would you do? Would you begin with RFP, and then if it doesn't work, then recommend the,
Deputy
or
Norman?
would you go right with the?
I think that's a Deputy Norman. Are you offering to answer that? Okay.
I'll answer that. I'm not going to have Joanna take on that question. So what would staff have done if it was just up to staff to be able to do that? I think it goes to the underlying question. Whatever is done most quickly to be able to support our LEAs into getting something that is credible that they can use and change quickly according to their own context. That was our intent. So whatever process that is to be able to meet the need quickly and get it and involve educators, because we have found when we involve educators, then they're actually the trainer model. They're now the experts and can go back into their own LEAs and say, here's what's coming. They can pilot in their own classrooms and provide that feedback. So that's whatever the process is that would be done most quickly to serve the needs of our LEAs.
Any further question or discussion to the, still on the amendment? No, we are still on the amendment. Member Lear's amendment to the substitute. All right. With that, Member Davis, did you have a final comment?
Well, not on the amendment, just
Okay.
on,
All right, so with the amendment to the substitute motion, the motion for the body, or amendment for the body is substitute and provide in the process that the grantee would engage. So we are substituting process for RFP contract and grantee for vendor. All in favor of that, please raise your hands. We have 6 in favor, 1 absent. So that motion fails by a vote of 6 to 8, correct? Okay, so now we're on to the substitute motion, unamended, which is that the board approves $400,000 from state discretionary funds and $400,000 from inter-release funds in a competitive grant process and provide in the RFP contract that the vendor would engage with LEA educators who would serve as content writers for the curriculum. I'm sorry, let's see, vendor. It was vendor, so we just, yeah, so I read it correctly. Okay. All right, that's the motion on the floor. Substitute motion. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Do we have the yeas on that? 1, 2, 3.
well, it really needs to be amended. Competitive grant.
All right, did we get the yeas on that? Okay, and straight? I just want to make sure we capture it. Remember, straight was a yes. Okay, that motion fails by 5 to 10? Okay. That puts us back to the underlying original motion from Member Earl, which is that the board approved the 2023 Social Studies RFP process as follows. USBE impanels an RFP Social Studies Committee to oversee the RFP process for the Social Studies Standards K through 6. The committee consists of 3 board members and appropriate staff. Board members may submit Social Studies RFP recommendations to the committee to elementary social studies specialist for consideration by February 16th at 5 o'clock. The committee reviews recommendations and other related materials and publishes an RFP. The committee reviews the RFP vendor proposals and selects a vendor. The committee prepares a contract between USBE and the vendor and places it on the USBE consent calendar for approval in a regular USBE board meeting. After the contract is approved and signed, the committee convenes to review the vendor's deliverables at key checkpoints as outlined in the RFP and contract. And approve the use of $400,000 from state discretionary funds and $400,000 from inter-release funds for the RFP. Any further discussion to that motion? Member Davis and then Member Lear.
Well, I would just speak against the motion because this takes a minimum of 4 months and the competitive grant takes a month to get going, and we hear from our educators in the process.
Member Lear.
Correct.
Member Lear.
Is after the contract is approved and signed, the committee convenes? Is that the 3 board members? Is that consists of board members and appropriate staff? Is that
I
what the
think
committee
that's board members and staff, is my understanding. Is that to the maker of the
That would
motion?
be accurate.
So that's a committee of board members and the appropriate staff. So go ahead, feel free to speak to the motion.
I would add, thank you for the clarification. I would add, it's unfortunate we don't have the trust that 3 board members would provide balanced standards, and we'll find ourselves back again in a 5-hour discussion of picking apart these standards. So I think it's unfortunate, but I feel like that's where we'll be with this.
Then amend.
Well, we shall see, I suppose. Is that is the process in the motion of selecting in the committees? I heard that, but I don't see
Not in there.
where that is. So I heard that was the selection process, but
I'd like to make amendment.
okay, let's hear it.
I would just, the recommendation is that each of our standing committees pick someone to be for the RFP 2023 Social Studies RFP Committee.
And I'll just ask for clarification. By pick, do you mean by vote, by selection of committee leadership?
However,
What's
that committee leadership chooses, whether that's vote or.
Okay, so committee leadership in each committee shall select a process for choosing a member of the committee to serve on the committee. Of the standing committee to serve on the RFP committee. Is that right? Okay. That's the proposed amendment to the original motion. It's been seconded by Member Carey. Any discussion of the amendment? Member Davis?
I'd like to amend that it be a competitive grant with LEAs rather than an RFP for a vendor.
So we have an amendment.
Everything else the same.
We have one amendment on the floor now for the addition of the standing committee. Let's get a vote on that, see if it passes, and then if so, there might be other amendment opportunities. That's the
Oh,
amendment.
sorry, I jumped ahead.
Is that
You're right.
okay? That's all right. So that's the amendment on the floor. Any discussion to that amendment? All right, all those in favor?
I have
Oh,
a motion to amend.
motion to amend the amendment?
Yes.
I think that's in order. We have an initial motion.
I would like to delete will select and will vote on 1 board member to serve.
Okay. Is that a friendly, or do we need to put that to a vote?
So what would it be?
We'll vote on.
So tomorrow in committee, we
Yeah,
would
yeah.
put forward names and maybe someone will just volunteer and we say all yes or.
Without objection, that's accepted as a friendly? Okay, so each standing committee, the amendment is each standing committee will vote on 1 board member to serve on the committee, by which we mean the RFP committee, correct? Okay. Any further discussion to that amendment? If not, all in favor, please raise your hand. That unanimous? Okay, that amendment passes unanimously. We now have the original motion as amended. Do I have to reread that whole thing? Member Davis has, I'm sorry, back to you before
I
we get to
amend
this.
that the entire motion stays the same, except it changes from an RFP to a competitive grant. And I'd like to speak to the amendment.
Second.
Does that have a second? Has a second? Please go ahead and speak to the motion.
This would allow us to get moving faster. It would get us started in about a month with a competitive grant, and it would involve our boots on the ground in writing the materials, and they know our community standards as opposed to who knows who the RFP could be, in-state, out-of-state, someone who understands our community standards or not. So I think we need to go with a competitive grant versus an RFP vendor.
Thank you, Member Davis. Any further discussion? Do we have that up on the? We do. Okay. further discussion to that proposed amendment? Okay. Making sure I'm not missing a procedural. All right. Okay, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. Yeah. All right, that motion passes 13-2. 13-2. Okay, we now have the underlying motion as amended, which is, help me out, Sybil. Do I have to read it all now and substitute? I think we do. Okay. All right. Let's scroll up again. Yeah, sorry. Let's give you a minute to substitute the. We got a legislation. Oh, we gotta. All right. Am I okay to read the new one, or just let me know when? Member Straight?
Point of clarification, because I'm not sure I see it in here. My understanding from before is that in a competitive grant like this, could they bid on just one grade or 3 grades, or does it have to be the whole thing? One grant to one group? Or is that still up in the air? I'm just trying to figure it out.
Deputy Norman, did you want to? Sorry.
Yeah, and again, if Assistant Superintendent Jacobson comes up, she loves it when she, or Adam as well, so thank you. In the competitive grant process, it's whatever is outlined in your stipulations for that grant. Therefore, in LEA, let's say that they are a K2 school, which we have K2 schools, and they might want to just do the K2 piece. It would depend on whether or not your rubric states that that is applicable, and you could then portion off the amount of money as deemed appropriate for that expenditure. Deborah?
So there's multiple ways that this grant could potentially go out. And you could do it where you send out a grant to determine an LEA that wants to head this off. And they oversee it and write all the curriculum for all grades, bringing in other LEAs to support that. You can give out smaller grants to different LEAs to write their own grade specific for their, within their own LEAs. There's multiple ways to do it. But the bottom line is when we write the requirements for the grant, that is what they have to follow. So that's what will have to be determined is what are the requirements in the grant. Does that kind of help a little?
Please.
So I guess that doesn't need to be stated here in this motion to occur. It'll happen. Okay.
Yes.
Then I am good.
All right. If there are no further lights, let's read the motion and take a vote. Vice Chair Earl's motion is that the board approve the 2023 Social Studies competitive grant process as follows. USB impanels the Social Studies Grant Committee to oversee the competitive grant process for the Social Studies Standards K6. Committee consists of 3 board members and appropriate staff. Board members may submit social studies competitive grant process recommendations to the committee, to elementary social studies specialist for consideration by February 16th at 5 o'clock. The committee reviews recommendations and other related materials and publishes a competitive grant. The committee reviews the grant proposals and selects a vendor. The committee prepares a grant agreement between USBE and the vendor and places it on the USBE consent calendar for approval in a regular USBE board meeting. After the grant agreement is approved and signed, the committee convenes to review the vendor's deliverables and key checkpoints as outlined in the competitive grant process and contract, approve the use of $400,000 from state discretionary funds and $400,000 from mineral lease funds for the competitive grant. Each standing committee will vote on 1 board member to serve on the committee. All in favor, please rate.
Point of clarification, does vendor matter? Does a vendor,
does the
word
word
matter?
vendor?
Do we need to change that to grantee?
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, vendor is changed to grantee. Any further clarification or?
I just have one question. How many meetings will be expected of your 3 board members between today and the 15th?
Not sure we know that. Could be one. It specifies that they will meet. Doesn't define the quantity or length. Right.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So the motion is before the body. All in favor, please raise your hand. That is unanimous. All right. Well, thank you, Deputy Norman and all. All right, we got there. Thank you for all of our staff for guiding us through the process. Trust the process, right? All right. All right. Next item, number 10, is, I believe, general session legislative preparation, or Director Thronson?
Excuse me, Chair.
Am I off track?
Thoughts on a 5-minute restroom break or maybe a 2-minute restroom break?
Sure.
It turns into a 5-minute restroom break?
Let's take 2 and try to hold to it, and
Thank you, sir.
we won't expel anybody if it's 5.